The Life of George Washington, in words of one syllable, by Josephine Pollard. Chapter 8. The Battle of Bunker Hill. In the year 1775, war was rife in New England. The King's laws were felt to be more for slaves than for freemen, and all made up their minds to throw off the yoke. They could not bear the sight of the redcoats, and the King's troops were just as fierce in their hate of our men. Ships of war brought a large force of troops to New England, led by men of rank and fame. They filled the streets of Boston, and it was thought that they might bring the Americans to terms, and not a drop of blood be shed. But this was not to be. A large force of our men were in camp on the hills and fields near Boston, the sight of whom might well cause the well-clad British to smile. They had left their farms in great haste at the cry of "To arms!" had seized their guns and come in homespun clothes it was their pride to wear. Those from Massachusetts were led by General Artemas Ward, those from New Hampshire by Colonel John Stark, those from Rhode Island by General Nathaniel Greene, and those from Connecticut by General Israel Putnam, all brave and true men and full of fight. But the troops had need to be well armed, and all the guns and such things as there was need of in times of war were in Boston, where the redcoats were on guard. But though sharp eyes were on the watch, sly deeds were done by those who knew the ways in and out of each storehouse. Carts went out of town heaped high with dirt, in which guns and balls were hid, and all sorts of tricks were used to get such things past the redcoats. At length it came to the ears of General Gage that some field guns were at Salem, and he sent troops to seize them. But when they reached Salem they found no guns there. The word came to General Gage that there was a large stock of arms and war stores at Concord, which was less than a score of miles from Boston. In the night of April 18th the redcoats set out for Concord. General Gage had said that no one but the troops should leave the town. But the news was borne to Lexington, a town on the road to Concord, by those who were as swift as the hare and sly as the fox. The folks there met in groups, with hearts on fire. Bells were rung and guns were fired. Men who heard these sounds ran as fast as they could to Lexington to hold the bridge and keep back the foe. At 5 o'clock on the morn of April 19th, the redcoats came in sight, and at once 70 men stood out on the green near the wall to meet them. Major Pitcairn, who was at the head of the King's troops, called out to these brave men to lay down their arms and leave the place, but they paid no heed to his words. Then he sprang from the ranks, shot off a small gun, swung his sword in the air and told his men to fire. The troops ran up with loud cheers and poured a storm of shot on our men, some of whom were killed. Then they pushed on to Concord and did all the harm they could at that place, spiked guns, threw pounds and pounds of shot down the wells, and spoiled a large lot of the flour and food that had been stored for use in time of need. When the King's troops turned back to Lexington, they were quite worn out with what they had done, and would have been cut down by our men if Gage had not sent a force to their aid. For the bluecoats had flown to arms, and poured into Lexington by all the roads that led thereto. The redcoats might laugh at their clothes, and the way in which they tried to keep step, but they found out that they knew how to use guns, and that each man was a dead shot. The fresh troops Gage sent up from Boston had to form a square, so that the worn out men who had had a long march and hard work might have a chance to rest. Then they all set out to march back to Boston, with 2 field guns in the rear to keep off the flock of Yankees, who dogged their steps and kept up a fire in front and rear and from each stone wall and hedge that lined the road. There was loss on both sides, but what hurt the King's troops the most was to be put to flight by such a lot of scarecrows as they thought our troops were. A close watch was kept on Boston by our men, who were soon in such force that it would not have been safe for the redcoats to try to leave the town. The King's troops did not like to be shut in this way, and lost no chance to mock at and taunt those who kept them at bay. On the north side of Boston lay a long strip of land, from the heights of which one could see the town and all the ships at or near the wharves. Putnam thought it would be a good plan to seize these heights and place troops there, but Ward and Warner thought it was not safe to risk it. It might bring on a fierce fight and cause much blood to be shed. Putnam had no fear of his own men. He knew how brave they were, and how well they could fight back of a screen. They had no fear of their heads, he said. Their chief thought is their legs. Shield them, and they'll fight on till doomsday. 2 or 3 of those who had led troops in the French war were of the same mind as Putnam, and their words had weight. The chief man was Colonel Prescott, who was just the style of man, in port and in dress, that a lot of raw troops would look up to. He wore a fine hat, a top wig, and a blue coat faced and lapped up at the skirts. He it was whom General Ward chose to lead the troops which were to seize the Heights, build the earthworks there, and guard them from the foe. There were 1,200 in all, and they set out on the night of June 16th, 1775. Not a light was shown, not a sound was heard, but the tramp, tramp, tramp of these men on their way to face death. A small neck of land joined Charleston to the mainland, and as they drew near this the troops hushed their steps and moved with great care. For on this the redcoats kept a close watch. 5 of their ships of war stood so that their guns would sweep this neck of land, and earthworks were on Copp's Hill, which faced Charleston. On the bluecoats went, past the guards, past the guns, past the neck, and up to the heights of Bunker's Hill. Here they were to make their stand, but it was found that Breed's Hill, which was half a mile off, was not quite so steep, and would give them more of a chance at the redcoats, while Bunker's Hill would shield them in the rear. Putnam thought Breed's Hill was the right place, and was in haste from the work to go on. There was no time to lose, so pick and spade were brought out, and the earth dug out so as to serve as a wall to screen them from the fire of the foe. The night was warm and still. Now and then Prescott would steal down to the edge of the stream to see and hear if the redcoats had made a stir. There was not a sound save the cry of all's well from the watchmen on guard in the town and on the ships of war. All night the work on the heights went on. At dawn of day the men there were seen by the seamen on the ships of war, and at once their guns were brought up and turned on the hill. Their shot did not harm the works, but one man who went outside was killed, and this threw the rest into a great fright. They were not used to scenes of war, and the sight of a man shot down in their midst was more than their nerves could stand. Some took to their heels at once and did not come back, and had Prescott not been a brave man himself, he could not have held his troops as he did. He stood up on top of the earthworks in full view of the redcoats, and talked with his men, and his words of cheer put new strength in their hearts, so that they were in less dread of the balls that whizzed near them. The noise of the guns roused the redcoats in Boston, and General Gage gazed at Breed's Hill like one in a dream. A fort full of men had sprung up in the night. How had it been done? What kind of men were these he had to meet? As he stood on Copp's Hill and looked through his field glass, he spied the tall form of Prescott in his blue coat on the wall of the fort. "Will he fight?" asked Gage. "Yes, sir," said one who stood near, and who knew Prescott. "He will fight to the last drop of blood, but I can't say as much for his men." "We must seize the works," cried Gage, and at once called up his chiefs for a talk, and to plan the best way to do this deed. The noise in the streets of Boston, the roll of the drum, the sound of the trump that calls to war, the sharp clicks of hoofs, and the deep roll of wheels that bore the field guns were heard on the heights, and let the troops there to know the war was at hand. The men were worn out with their hard task, and their loss of sleep. They had not brought much food with them, and their thirst was great. The heat made them feel weak and dull. There was need of more men, and a lot of raw New Hampshire troops led by Colonel Stark came to their aid. In the meantime those on the height had to bear the fire of the guns from the ships and from Copp's Hill, which broke on them at 10 o'clock. At noon the bluecoats saw more than a score of boats full of troops cross from Boston in straight lines. The sun shone on their red coats, and flashed from the tips of the guns they bore, and from the brass field guns that stood on the deck. It was a gay scene. They made their way to a point north of Breed's Hill, where General Howe, who led them, could see the full strength of the bluecoats. They had more troops than he thought, and he caught sight of fresh ones on their way to Breed's Hill. Howe at once sent to Gage for more troops, and more balls for the field guns, and as it would take some time for them to be sent round, the redcoats in the meantime were served with food and drink. The grog was passed round in pails, and the men sat round on the grass and ate and drank their fill, while the poor men on the heights looked down and longed to share their feast. But while the redcoats took their ease, the bluecoats had a chance to add to the strength of their fort, and to push out the breastworks to a point known as the Slough. Near this was a pass where the foe might turn the left flank of the troops or seize Bunker's Hill. Putnam chose one of his men, a Captain Knowlton, to hold this pass with his Connecticut troops. He at once set to work to build a sort of fort, back of which his men could fight with more ease than if they stood out in the field. Not a long way off was the post and rail fence set in a low foot wall of stone, and this fence ran down to the Mystic River. The posts and rails of the fence near this were torn up in haste and set a few feet at the rear of it, and the space twixt the two was filled with new mown hay brought from the fields near at hand. While Knowlton and his men were at work on the fence, Putnam and his troops threw up the work on Bunker's Hill. In the meantime Stark had set out from Medford on a 6-mile march. He was a cool, calm man, and had been through the French War, of which I have told you. He led his men at a slow pace, so that they would be fresh and strong to take part in the fight. As they came up to the neck, which they had to cross, and which was lined with guns on both sides, one of the aides urged him to let the men take a quick step. The old man shook his head and said, "One fresh man in a fight is worth 10 tired ones," and kept on at the same pace, and did good work that day back of the post and rail screen. Warren, who had been made a Major General, came to serve in the ranks. Putnam said he might lead the troops at the fence. He said he did not care to lead. He was there to fight. "Where will the fire be the hottest?" he asked. He was told that the fort on Breed's Hill was the point the foe sought to gain. "If we can hold that," said Putnam, "the day is ours." Warren at once made his way there, and the troops gave a round of cheers when he stepped into the fort. Prescott, who was not so high in rank, sought to have Warren take charge of the troops, but he would not. "I have come to serve in the ranks," he said, "and shall be glad to learn from one so well skilled as yourself." The redcoats thought to take the works with ease and win the day. General Piggott with the left wing was to mount the hill and seize the earthworks, while General Howe came up with the right wing to turn the left flank of our men and stop all flight at the rear. Piggott and his men came up to the height, and not a gun was fired by our troops till the redcoats were in range. Then, as they were all good marksmen, each shot told, and some of the best men fell at the first fire. The foe fell back in haste, but were brought up once more by those who stood at their head with drawn swords. They were met by a fire more fierce than the first, and vexed by guns that bore on their flank from the band of men in Charleston. So much blood had been shed, and the men were in such a state of fright, that Piggott was forced to give the word to fall back. We will now see what sort of luck General Howe had. He led his troops up the bank of the stream, and thought to take the slight breastwork with ease, and so get in the rear of the fort. But he did not know the ground, and could not bring his large guns through the swamp he met with. In the pause some of his men were hurt and some killed by the guns that were set by the post and rail fence. Howe's men kept up a fire as they came on, but as they did not take good aim, the balls flew o'er the heads of our troops, who had been told to hold their fire till the redcoats were quite near. Some few did not do as they were told, and Putnam rode up and swore he would cut down the next man that fired ere he had the word to do so. When the redcoats were in the right range, such a storm of lead poured on them from guns in the hands of men who did not miss a mark that the place was like a field of blood. Such a host were slain that the redcoats lost heart and fell back in great haste. Some of them ran back as far as the boats, and got on board of them that they might be safe from the fire of the marksmen. Once more the redcoats charged the fort, which it was their aim to get into their own hands. In the meantime the shells from Copp's Hill and the ships of war had set Charleston on fire. The town was built of wood, and was soon a mass of flames. The dense smoke put out the light of the sun. On all sides was heard the din of war. The big guns kept up their great roar. Bombshells burst in the air. The sharp hiss of the small balls and the shouts and yells of the men made a scene to strike the heart with awe. Our men stood firm, and with the eyes fixed on the foe, who, as soon as they were close at hand, were shot down by the guns whose aim was so sure. The redcoats stood the first shock, and then kept on, but they were met by such a stream of fire that they were soon brought to a halt. In vain did the men who led them urge them on with drawn swords. Whole ranks were mowed down. Some of General Howe's staff were slain, and the troops, wild with fear, broke ranks and fled down the hill. For a third time General Howe brought up his men, some of whom threw off their knapsacks and some their coats, that they may not be weighed down by them. The redcoats made a feint, as if they would take the fort at the fence, and did much harm there to our men. While some of his troops were at work at the point, Howe brought the rest of his force to the front and rear of the main fort, which was then stormed on three sides at once. Prescott told some of his men to stand at the back part of the fort and fire at the redcoats that showed themselves on the wall. Soon one leaped up and cried, "The day is ours," and was shot down at once, as were all those who had joined him. But our men had fired their last round, and there was naught for them to do but meet the foe in a hand-to-hand fight. With stones and the butt ends of their guns they sought to drive back the redcoats, but the tide was too strong for them, and they had to give way. Warren, who had done brave work that day, was the last to leave the fort. He scarce had done so ere he was struck by a ball and fell dead on the spot. As our troops fled by way of Bunker Hill, Putnam ran to the rear and cried, "Halt! Make a stand here! We can check them yet! In God's name, form, and give them one shot more!" But the troops could not be brought to a stand, and the redcoats won the day, but with loss of more than half their men, and it hurt their pride to think that it had cost them so dear to take these earthworks that had been thrown up in one night by a mere handful of raw troops. Their loss was 1,054. Our loss was 450. End of chapter 8.